May, 1565. A tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean. A fortress order of a few hundred knights, exiled from their last home, with nowhere left to retreat to. Sailing toward them, one of the largest Ottoman invasion fleets ever assembled, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, sent by the most powerful ruler in the world. If Malta fell, there was very little standing between the Ottoman navy and the coasts of Sicily, Italy, and the heart of Catholic Europe. Everyone on both sides understood exactly what was at stake. The man leading the defense was Jean Parisot de Valette, Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, a military religious order that had already been driven out of one island fortress by the Ottomans, decades earlier. This time, there was no next island to retreat to. This time, it was Malta or nothing. Here is the detail that still stuns historians today. By the time the siege finally ended, months later, the Ottoman army, one of the most feared military forces on earth, had been forced to withdraw, having failed to take the island at all. And here's a smaller, colder detail most people never hear. At one point during the siege, the knights responded to Ottoman brutality by firing the severed heads of Ottoman prisoners back across the harbor from their own cannons. This was not a clean, chivalrous war. It was one of the most brutal sieges of the 16th century, fought by both sides without mercy. Before we go further, every detail in this video comes from documented history, contemporary accounts written by people who were there, Ottoman and European military records, and the work of modern historians of the Knights of St. John and the Ottoman Empire. This is the Great Siege of Malta, 1565. To understand why this siege happened at all, you have to go back to 1522. That year, Suleiman the Magnificent, then still early in his reign, personally led an Ottoman force that captured the island of Rhodes from the Knights of St. John after a brutal siege of his own. The knights were allowed to leave Rhodes with their lives and their arms, but they lost their home. For several years afterward, the order wandered without a permanent base, until in 1530, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted them the islands of Malta, Gozo, and the North African outpost of Tripoli, in exchange for a token yearly rent, famously, a single Maltese falcon. By the 1560s, the Knights of St. John had turned Malta into a heavily fortified base, and their galleys had become a constant threat to Ottoman shipping and to Muslim pilgrims and merchants across the Mediterranean. Suleiman, now an old man in the final years of his reign, decided to finish what he had started at Rhodes decades earlier, eliminate the Knights of St. John entirely, and secure the central Mediterranean for Ottoman power. The invasion fleet that set sail for Malta in the spring of 1565 was enormous. Modern historians place Ottoman troop numbers in the range of roughly 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers, transported by well over 100 ships, an overwhelming force compared to the defenders waiting for them. Grand Master La Valette had roughly 500 to 600 knights of the order under his direct command, along with several thousand Maltese militia, and additional Spanish and Italian soldiers and mercenaries, bringing the total defending force to somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 9,000 men, depending on the source. It was still a dramatic mismatch. But it was not strictly 500 men against 40,000. It was a few hundred elite knights anchoring a broader defense of several thousand Maltese and allied troops, against an Ottoman force several times their size. Ottoman command was divided between Piali Pasha, commanding the fleet, and Mustafa Pasha, commanding the land forces, a split command that would cause friction throughout the campaign. Partway through the siege, the famous Ottoman corsair Admiral Turgut Reis, known in the West as Dragut, arrived to reinforce the attack, bringing decades of Mediterranean naval experience with him. The Ottomans landed in mid-May 1565 and made an early decision that would cost them dearly. Rather than striking directly at the main fortified towns of Birgu and Singlia, where La Valette had concentrated his strongest defenses, Mustafa Pasha chose to first attack the smaller outpost of Fort St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to Malta's Grand Harbor. Fort St. Elmo was expected to fall within days. It held out for nearly a month. The garrison inside fought under constant bombardment and repeated assaults, and though the fort finally fell on June 23, 1565, it cost the Ottoman army an enormous toll. Modern estimates suggest several thousand Ottoman casualties, including, critically, the death of Dragut himself, killed by cannon fire during the siege of the fort he had come to help capture. That 1 month of delay at Fort St. Elmo mattered enormously. It burned through Ottoman time, ammunition, and soldiers before the main assault on Malta's core defenses had even truly begun. After Fort St. Elmo fell, the fighting turned openly brutal. Ottoman forces reportedly mutilated the bodies of several knights killed in the fort's capture, nailing some to wooden crosses and setting them adrift across the harbor toward Fort St. Angelo, in an act of psychological warfare aimed directly at Valette and his remaining knights. Valette's response was equally brutal. He ordered Ottoman prisoners executed, and had their severed heads fired from cannons back across the harbor toward the Ottoman lines. This siege was not fought with restraint on either side. Through July and August 1565, the Ottomans launched repeated massive assaults against the fortified positions of Birgu and Singlia, using tunnels, mines, and sustained artillery bombardment to try to break through the walls. One of the most dramatic moments came when Ottoman forces attempted an amphibious night assault on Singlia by floating troops across the harbor, an attack that was detected and repelled with heavy Ottoman losses, aided by a defensive chain the knights had stretched across the water to block enemy boats. Through it all, Valette reportedly refused to retreat to the inner citadel even as the outer walls came under direct attack, staying visibly present among his men on the defensive lines, a detail recorded by multiple contemporary chroniclers of the siege, not a later embellishment. By late summer, both sides were exhausted. Ottoman forces had suffered devastating losses in front of walls they still had not broken through, and the campaign season was slipping away. On September 7, 1565, a long-awaited relief force from Spanish Sicily, known to history as the Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief, finally landed on Malta under the command of Viceroy Don Garcia de Toledo. Facing a fresh, reinforced enemy after months of brutal attrition, the Ottoman command made the decision to withdraw. By September 11, 1565, the Ottoman fleet had abandoned the siege entirely and sailed home, ending nearly 4 months of siege warfare without achieving their objective. So, what did the Great Siege of Malta actually change? Let's be precise about the title's framing first. It wasn't exactly 500 knights against 40,000 soldiers in a clean one-on-one sense. The defense of Malta relied on several thousand Maltese militia and allied troops fighting alongside those knights, and Ottoman numbers are debated within a real range by historians. But strip away the rounding, and the core fact holds up completely: a heavily outnumbered defending force, built around a few hundred knights of a single religious military order, held one of the most powerful militaries on earth to a months-long standstill and forced its withdrawal. The consequences went far beyond Malta itself. News of the Ottoman failure spread across Catholic Europe as a major psychological victory at a moment when Ottoman expansion had seemed almost unstoppable for decades. It helped galvanize European naval cooperation in the years that followed, contributing to the coalition that would meet and defeat a major Ottoman fleet 6 years later, at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. For the Knights of St. John, the siege became the defining moment of the order's history. In its aftermath, Valette oversaw the construction of a new heavily fortified capital city on the peninsula where some of the worst fighting had taken place, a city later named Valette, in his honor, which remains Malta's capital to this day. And here is the quiet irony sitting underneath the whole story. Suleiman the Magnificent had already personally driven the Knights of St. John out of one island, at Rhodes, in 1522. He spent his final years trying to finish the job at Malta, and failed. Roughly a year after the siege ended, in 1566, Suleiman died during another campaign entirely, at the Siege of Sigetvar in Hungary, never having achieved the total destruction of the order he had chased for over 4 decades. The order that Suleiman tried twice to erase outlived him. The Knights of St. John continued to hold Malta for over 2 centuries afterward, and the fortress city built from the ashes of that siege still carries the name of the man who refused to surrender it. That's the real lesson underneath the drama of 1565. Superior numbers decide most battles, but not always the war. Sometimes the side that cannot afford to lose fights differently than the side that only expects to win, and that difference at Malta turned out to matter more than the size of either army. This has been the Great Siege of Malta, 1565.